Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the SLC podcast. This week it'll be just Clark and I, as opposed to the roundtable of last week, talking about three issues as it pertains to the Utah Jazz and basketball. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Clark, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. How are you, Andy?
I'm doing well. I'm Andy Larson. You can find me on Twitter at Andy B. Larson. And Clark, you can find at JazzingItClark on Twitter. So, Clark, the first question I wanted to ask you today is Kevin Murphy was signed last week, getting the roster to be at 15 players. Wondered if you would rank them 1 through 15 from best to worst on their current ability, not potential. And we'll see how your ranking list compares to mine as the season stands to begin.
Okay. I thought this was a pretty fun exercise. It's difficult. I'm actually probably more excited to explain to you my method of figuring this out.
So I am excited.
Yeah, I had a good time with it. So what I first did is I just made a list. I don't know if people know my kind of methods. I usually try to do a little mixture of statistical analysis plus kind of looking at things and using your eyes and also using your kind of logic to put things in order. And so what I did is I decided I wanted to get rid of all the biases I might have, and so I just made a list of kind of what I thought just from a gut reaction, kind of using my head and my heart to just kind of make a list. And I wanted to get that out of the way and then kind of see also where my statistical analysis or other analyses would lead me. So I'll just tell you, I have Millsap, Favors, Jefferson, Hayward, Mo Williams, Marvin Williams, Alec Burks, Enes Kanter, Randy Foye, Jeremy Evans, Raja Bell, Earl Watson, Tinsley, Carroll, and Murphy. That was a list I made just right off the bat, kind of just thinking about it for about 1 minute.
Okay.
But as I'll explain, I won't tell you every list, but as I'll explain, my list really evolved as I looked at some things. So
now, are you going to make 5 different lists like a Bleacher Report article? I hear you're good at those now.
No. That was just a one-time thing. I actually did. That's funny. I did make 5 different lists for different ways. So that's what I did. So I made that list, and then I wanted to see how that would evolve. So what I actually did is I used the websites 82games.com, basketballvalue.com, and basketballreference.com. And I just wanted to see kind of what they thought of our players, because they kind of give values according to it's because it's hard to compare players, one-on-one in a vacuum, but that's what you try to do. It's a team sport, but you don't want to, give them more weight for playing a certain position or being small or big. And so I think those websites kind of help you value. I just look at the players like what's their overall production on the court to team play, to allowing their team to either score or to hold the other team to less points. So, the lists were all different, but what I found, and you may have found this, and I think this is probably hard to debate, is that all the websites mostly thought the same 4 players were our top 4 players. So I don't know if you feel differently, but I think you have to go with Al Jefferson, Paul Millsap, Derek Favors, and Gordon Hayward being our top 4 players. Do you have any disagreement to that?
No question. That's absolutely right.
And so some of these sites kind of had different values to these players. But what I found through all of these is that, I'll tell you what, one thing I found is that it's really hard to place Jeremy Evans in this list because some websites really like him and some websites don't, which probably goes to show that he's probably pretty average to below average on this list. And another thing is I kind of have a worry about Mo Williams. I don't know if that's what you found or decided, but I'm glad we got Mo, but I worry about people's expectations of him being a big upgrade over Devin Harris because I just don't know if he is after this. But I'll tell you what I got for a list. So this is my final list, and I feel fantastic about this list after everything I did. And here's what it is. So I got Paul Millsap as our best player. Derek
Love it.
Favors as number 2. Al Jefferson as number 3. Okay, and let me tell you one other thing I did.
Okay.
After I used all these websites, I decided I wanted to do an adjusted rating. So with all the vets that have played more than 5 years in the league, I looked at their last 2 to 3 years to kind of get an idea of what they've been. Because
Okay.
a guy like Marvin Williams, for instance, had a great year last year. And
Right.
he ranks really highly if you just look at last season. But if you look at his last 2 or 3 seasons, I think you get a better picture of what kind of player he is today. And so I did that with the vets. But then with the young guys, since they're improving, I think without question, Cantor, Burks, Favors, and Hayward are all better than they were a year ago. And so I took the second half of their season and kind of gave it a little more weight to try to find a more true value of what kind of player they are.
So let me ask you that with regards to Al Jefferson and Derek Favors. Did you, when you looked at Derek Favors' second half of the season, what did you find?
Well, he had pretty good numbers. So that's a good question. So one thing I found was that so if you look at something like Basketball Reference, or essentially kind of their plus-minus value weighted a little bit more advanced, you find that overall Derek Favors only had, I think, maybe like a 1 or 2 point positive influence on the game. But if you look at the last 20 to 40 games, it's more like 6 or 7 points. I think you see a really, if you look at the games that he played significant minutes in, we tended to hold opponents to a lot less points. I think that's obvious to everybody.
Right.
And I guess the tiebreaker there is, I think some of the websites preferred Favors. Most of them actually preferred Jefferson. But having Jefferson on the floor, I think it certainly improves our offense more than Favors would. But it doesn't make us necessarily an elite offensive team. But Derek Favors has, and I think has the ability right now, starting today, to make us an elite defensive team. I guess that's my reasoning there. And then also, I think, if you look at each of their weaknesses, I think Favors' weakness is less severe than Al Jefferson at this point.
Interesting.
You could certainly argue Jefferson over Favors, and I think, and you might, but I just think going forward, starting from game 1 of this upcoming season, I think you're going to see Favors have a bigger impact on the game.
See, and I think he just has too far of a gap to reach there. Like, if we look at how, for example, let me just look at their Basketball Reference win shares.
Mm-hmm.
Even in win shares per 48, so not counting that Jefferson got more minutes, Jefferson's win shares per 48 is about double what Favors is.
Mm-hmm.
Double, a little bit less than double, 73% more. How about that?
Yeah.
To me, he has such a huge gap in order to get to where Al Jefferson is as a player. And honestly, the biggest difference there is surprisingly assist-to-turnover ratio,
Right.
where Al Jefferson actually was a very good, I shouldn't say very good, but a much better passer last year. He had about the same assist percentage as Paul Millsap, and of course, as we all know, his turnovers are uber low. And Favors still struggles with that sometimes.
Oh, he's pretty bad at that, actually. But go ahead.
So I think I agree that Favors' influence on defense is huge, and we saw that a lot in the Spurs series. But I think Favors is less far along offensively than people want him to be.
No, I think that's fair. And but if I had to ask you, let's say hypothetically, if Jefferson and Favors play the same amount of minutes, who gets some more rebounds?
Favors.
Yeah, I think so too. And Jefferson probably leads in every other statistical category, especially points, because he's going to get his shots. But I think just so the website that I actually prefer out of all of these is probably Basketball Value with their, and you've explained it before, but it's kind of it's a plus minus, how good is your team when you're on the court or off the court, but it also adjusts it to the importance of the minutes, and also who you're playing, who you're on the court with. And so Favors gets a little bit of a bump there, assuming that some of his plus minus numbers were affected by the fact he was playing with Earl Watson or CJ Miles or Enes Kanter.
Right.
And Basketball Value actually has Favors as a little bit better than Jefferson. And if you also look at Jefferson from 2 years ago, which, you don't want to, but Jefferson had a very good year last year for the Jazz, and I think, a testament to him and his effort last offseason is that 2 years ago he had a horrible effect on the Jazz and their ability to win games. I think actually a lot of websites, the plus minus, and especially Basketball Value, basically had him as just making the Jazz pretty much worse when he played. And he was a positive on the team last year, and that was a huge turnaround for him. And I think he'll keep that up. But I wonder if there's a limit to how he can affect the team defensively, I think. So it'll be interesting to see. But Basketball Value had Favors a little bit better than Jefferson.
Yeah, and I love Basketball Value too. I think a little bit of what's happening there is that their algorithm gives a little bit too much credit for that lineup to Paul Millsap.
Mm-hmm.
I love Paul Millsap, and I also think that he's the best player on the team. But Basketball Value has him as something like the fourth or fifth best player in the NBA, which he probably isn't.
Mm-hmm.
So if we kind of bump him down, and I think that allows us to spread more of the lineup juice points to other players, I think Jefferson comes out a little bit better, although I think you're still right that Favors would probably still lead from that website's statistics.
Yeah, and I should also mention, I think one thing that happened last year, and that's going to happen again this year, is that if our best player is a 7 or an 8 out of 10, the next best players, and even our, down the next 8 players, we probably don't go much lower than 5 or 6. We have pretty equal players, and you could certainly make an argument for Millsap, Favors, and Jefferson. I think they're our 3 best players. Yeah. Whatever order you want to go, you probably have a case there. So I'm not trying to, I just think that Jefferson has the biggest weakness out of those 3. Millsap and Jefferson are pretty equal offensively. And it's going to be interesting to see how Favors contributes offensively with those 2, though. So there's certainly argument there.
It really will be, and if we didn't argue on this podcast, then it'd be no fun. So we gotta give people a reason to listen, and that's what sports radio is all about. I've been told, or I guess informed, or probably not at this point of Utah sports radio. But anyway, I digress. Let's move on from the Jefferson Favors conversation. So you've got Hayward number 4, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So do I, but keep going down the list.
So I've got Gordon Hayward, who on some sites doesn't rank out that well, but I just think, he does so many things. And then actually, my first surprise probably, I've got Marvin Williams next.
Okay.
Partly because of his great year, but those sites seem to love his influence on the Hawks. The Hawks just made a big jump last year, especially defensively, and a lot of those points get attributed to Josh Smith and Marvin Williams, I think 3rd or 4th highest. So he gets a little bit of a bump there, and I think he might actually have a good year for us. After Marvin Williams, I've got Alec Burks. Then I'm going to Enes Kanter, and then I have Mo Williams, followed by Randy Foye, Jeremy Evans, Earl Watson, Jamal Tinsley, Raja Bell, Damari Carroll, and Kevin Murphy. No offense to Kevin Murphy, but it's just, I think he's the obvious choice as the worst player just because he hasn't even become accustomed to the NBA yet. Okay,
so I want to go back up to the beginning of where, I guess, the middle of your list now. Tell me more about Marvin versus Mo.
Let's see, which website? So if you look at something like, so first of all, I had the, it's hard to compare 2 teams on a lot of these websites because they're relative to their own teams. And so what I did is I did some number crunching per possessions and to see how they affected their individual team lineups and their own teams. And they both, and I think I got a pretty good idea of what their value was relatively to their team and to the Jazz. It was a bit of guesswork, but there's definitely a pretty big gap in the Jazz, after their top 6 or 7 guys, it makes a pretty big jump. And so, they're going to be, somewhere in that group of people.
Right.
But let's see. So Marvin Williams ranked pretty well on 82 games. He ranked better than Mo Williams, and he was equal with him on Basketball Value. And let's see. And Basketball Reference just really, I mean, Basketball Reference, Mo Williams kind of had a pretty neutral effect on the LA Clippers last year. And the LA Clippers are an interesting team just because, I mean, they had a lot of offensive firepower, but they're pretty poor defensively. And if you hear people talk about the positives of Mo Williams, like if you listen to, radio personalities, they mostly talk about his good three-point shooting and then kind of his toughness, his increased defense, and I get not bothered, but I get wary when I hear stuff like that because, those are kind of immeasurable things that you kind of just hope happen that you can't really see, and so I get worried about players that get described a lot like that because it might just be making up for something.
No, me too. That's what the baseball author Bill James, he's featured in the movie Moneyball, likes to refer to as a BS dump, where
right.
You have this idea of a player, how good a player is, and then you have the stats to back up that, and then there's usually a gap between what you believe is true and what the stats say. And you can make it up with this BS dump stuff of intangibles and toughness and plays the right way and makes his teammates better, that kind of stuff.
I mean, because it's really the way that a few of the guys on our team got time last year, but especially, I think Derek Fisher is the king of intangibles because the fact that guy played 20 minutes a night or whatever for the Thunder in the finals, he was killing them. Everyone could see it, but I guess they needed his, quote in the air, toughness on the floor. It's hard to see. It's hard for me to. I have some belief that there probably is something to that, some mental toughness, but I just think it translates less than we want to on the court. And I think Mo Williams is gonna, he's a good player, but I think we might find that we are a little wanting in some things that we thought we were going to get from him.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're probably overrating him a little bit coming into the season. I actually do have Mo over Marvin. And my reason for that is something you alluded to earlier, where Marvin had one of his best seasons, maybe his best season as a Atlanta Hawk player last year. But the 2 seasons before that were really pretty subpar. He had PERs around the 13 level, so fairly below average. And I worry that it could be a 1-year jump thing, or he may have trouble getting back to that level again, just based on his career performance so far.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and I definitely put in for that. But I think, with that being said, I think Marvin Williams probably has room for a little more growth within the system. I might be wrong, but he's a little bit younger, and there's probably a little more room for maybe making a jump. But, yeah, it's a toss-up. But it's funny also, I was surprised at some of Mo Williams' numbers, especially his last year with Cleveland. I saw that he averaged more than 7 assists, which is pretty surprising. So it's going to be interesting to see how many, if he's just a spot-up shooter, if he actually gets more involved in the offense, because he's obviously shown that he can be.
Yeah, that's the thing, is when he played as a point guard, he was much better than when he was playing as a shooting guard the last 2 years. And so I'm kind of hopeful for that return to form.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on down the list. You have Alec Burks, Enes Kanter, then Mo Williams, that's correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Remind me who's next on your list?
Randy Foye.
Okay.
And Jeremy Evans.
That's the same ordering I have for 7 through 10. Burks,
that is
Kanter,
funny.
Foye, Evans. I agree with you there. I think Burks and Kanter have both shown enough to be better than the relative consistent below averageness of Foye. And if you expect them to improve just a little bit off of their baselines, they're still significantly better than Foye. So Jeremy Evans next, and then who do you have after him?
Watson, Tinsley, Raja.
Okay, I got Watson and Tinsley too right after Evans, so we've got the same 7 through 12 now. Explain your decision as far as Earl versus Tinsley to me, because that was a tough one for me to do.
It is really hard. They're probably a 4.1 and a 4.0 player. I mean, they're close. Tinsley brings you a little, whatever true point guard, whatever that means these days. That's what he does a little more for you. He's pretty good at passing. I think if I remember correctly, he got us the first double-digit assist last year when he played. He started against the Warriors that one game.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but he struggles. I mean, he shoots a really poor percentage, even worse than Watson. I think he's probably a poor defender, which probably shows up in some of these statistics. Most of the websites had him pretty close, but I think they all had Tinsley below Watson in some sort of fashion.
Yeah, that's what I found. I love Tinsley's passing ability, and I love the flair he brings to the game. But
Mm-hmm.
in the end, I think Watson's defense makes a big difference
Mm-hmm.
with that second lineup. And yeah, and Tinsley, you're right that they're both pretty inefficient offensive players. They're guys that
Mm-hmm.
you probably don't want that out there on the floor. But Tinsley doesn't know it as much as Watson does,
Sure.
and so he shoots a lot more, and I think that ends up hurting the team compared to the other offensive options.
Yeah, neither of them are the type that you want hoisting a three-pointer because we have no other options in that set. So
Yeah, it gets ugly. Okay, so then you have Raja Bell, and my hatred / analysis of Raja Bell is strong. I actually have him as the 15th best player on the Jazz, i.e.,
yeah,
the very worst. And my argument there is that actually last year, using the Basketball Reference win shares rating, he was actually below replacement level.
mm-hmm.
So he's adding less than a random rookie would, say Kevin Murphy.
Mm-hmm.
If you can find a random D-League player to play better than Raja Bell did last year, I feel like we need to recognize him as a low-quality player. I just don't see how he adds anything of value to the team. Even his outside shooting, he had a good percentage from 3-point last year, but
Mm-hmm.
then he shoots it so rarely that it's like, okay, well, if you're only taking the 3 out of the 10 best opportunities that come to you, of course you're going to make a better percentage. In the end, he just hurts the team by his reticence to shoot and his complete inability to help in any other aspect of the game. And so that's why I have him last. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, and I think that's partly emotional. I definitely, when I first made my list, I had him second to last, just on the basis that if you're that big of a disruption in the locker room, then you can't be high on this list. But
That's
then I
fair.
realized we're talking about talent and production on the floor. We're not talking about locker room presence, even though that does matter. It isn't the defining factor in all these, or else I think our list would look a lot different. I mean. If he's the bottom of the list, I think that's fine. I think at this point it's fair to say he's not an NBA rotation player, and so veterans don't beat out the young small contracts that can fill a bench as well as they can. So
Well, and
there's
I
not
don't
really a
even
big
think he's an
argument for
NBA
me.
player at this point. I mean, we've seen how much trouble he's had trying to get a new contract in the NBA. That his
Right.
buyout would have gone through by now if he was able to find any team to give him a chance.
Yeah, but if he was able to sign a rookie minimum contract, I think but immediately he's 2 to 3 times more expensive than
That's fair.
another person to fill the bench, and so it's hard to measure their value. Kevin Murphy, we don't know. I mean, he has a contract. I don't know. We don't know any details. We don't know if that's a make good contract.
Yeah.
He had some flashes in summer league, but he might not be an end of the bench player, and so he really gets an NA. A not applicable or a hard, to be determined by his name, because you just really don't know what he's going to be.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, to me, Raja Bell was just that bad last year that an NA is literally better than the -0.2 or whatever he brought last year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I have him at the end of the list. But you're right that at this point, it's not actually all that critical who is the 13th or 14th or 15th best player.
Sure.
I'm glad that you have Carroll at the end of the list, though. In between, let's see, you've got Bell, Carroll, and then Murphy. I think Carroll's pretty highly overrated amongst Jazz fans because he just is not Josh Howard.
Sure.
Because his offense is not, he doesn't bring a lot there, and then his defense is just so terrible. His synergy stats are remarkably awful. I didn't know you could get that high, allowing your opponent to score that many points in such limited amounts of time.
Yeah, he has what I would call the Ronnie Price phenomenon, where the fans see one or maybe 5 plays in a game where he just goes all out hustle and makes a great play. I mean, he made a couple of just great hustle plays against the Spurs, and all of a sudden fans were saying, "This is what we needed." But I mean, when you look at the other 97 plays of that game, he's not affecting them very well, and it's exciting to see. But Ronnie Price was always really bad. Probably not even. I'm happy for him, but I don't know if he's an NBA player at this point.
Yeah.
And I think DeMarre Carroll's there, but it's fun to see. To mix things up on occasion. It's great to put him in there, but if you think you can put him in for 10 minutes a game and have him make a positive impact every game, I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong on him.
Yeah, and I think he may have a little bit of a chance to improve. It's only his 3rd season in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that being said, you're right about the Ronnie Price corollary. Okay. So I think
and
that's
to your point, I mean, that summer league game, I think it was the first summer league game, he was guarding Kyle Singler, a guy who's never played in the NBA. DeMarre Carroll should have been a vet at that camp, and I think Singler put up some 18 points on 10 shots, or mostly on DeMarre Carroll. He looked really bad at summer camp. But
just wasn't good enough.
Yeah. Anyway,
okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So, you've got your list. I'll just go ahead and throw out my list there before we move on to the next topic. I've got Paul Millsap number 1, Al Jefferson number 2, Derek Favors, Gordon Hayward, Mo Williams, then Marvin Williams, going through 3 through 6.
Mm-hmm.
Alec Burks, Enes Kanter, Randy Foye, Jeremy Evans, Earl Watson, and Jamal Tinsley, an identical 7 through 12 as your list. And then to wrap it all up, I've got DeMarre Carroll 13th, Murphy 14th, and the aforementioned ugly, despicable Raja Bell at number 15.
Tell us how you really feel, Andy.
He's a nice guy, I'm sure.
Okay, good.
He's got a great smile. He's awesome.
Yeah,
Raja Bell.
It's really too bad. This whole stay has been bad for him. It's been bad for the Jazz. It's really too bad.
Yeah, it's unfortunate too. I think that he's got the biggest ties to the Jazz beat writers, because then they get Raja Bell's point of view on the team, which I suspect is fairly biased. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
Okay, well, let's move on to our second topic. This is something that came off of a conversation you and I had at the last SLC Dunk get-together, where we start talking about the long-term future of the franchise and what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years with so much change around the team. And we start thinking, what if we never make the Al Jefferson trade? So Boozer's already gone. He's been signed by Chicago. We have a big gap at that position. Where is the franchise today, Clark, if we don't make the Al Jefferson trade?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of what-ifs in this, obviously. And this is a game I love to play, but for some Jazz fans, it's probably better not to play. You can drive yourself crazy wondering what if. You can do it all the way back to the early Stockton Malone years. But, I mean, this is really an interesting question. So what I had to remind myself, and what I learned as I read this, is that the Jazz were actually pretty committed in money. So we were committed to Darren Williams, Andre Kirilenko, Millsap, and Okur. Just those 4 players I think we owed $50 million to. And so we really didn't have a lot of money to spend, but we had that $16 million trade exception from the Carlos Boozer sign-in trade. And so basically what I did is I went and I looked at every transaction that happened over the next year that the Jazz could have been a part of other than the Al Jefferson trade. The first one off the bat, which I actually think would have been the most interesting, and before we go further, I think it's safe to say I don't see any of these scenarios probably persuading Darren Williams to do things differently in Utah. So I think you kind of have to assume that eventually things go that way. He probably gets traded for the same deal no matter what happens. I mean, you may disagree. We can talk about that. But I think the best thing that could have happened was the player that got traded just moments after Al Jefferson was traded to us was Tyson Chandler. Was traded from the Charlotte Bobcats to the Dallas Mavericks for a poo-poo platter and some money. And if, for instance, he had an expiring $12 million deal, if the Jazz had traded for Tyson Chandler, I mean, that's a pretty sweet team right there. You got Darren, they probably still wouldn't have been able to sign overpay for Corver or Wesley Matthews if they had have acquired Tyson Chandler. And so you probably still have Darren and Raja almost no matter what happens.
Yeah.
But you've got Kirilenko, Millsap, and Tyson Chandler. And that's really kind of a recreation of the talented Hornets teams from about 5 years previous, where Millsap, I think, is a lot like David West. You got kind of your defensive anchor, but Chandler was really a fantastic player 2 years ago for the Mavericks. He was the difference. I mean, look at that question. If the Mavericks trade for Al Jefferson and we trade for Tyson Chandler, I mean, I think our team is a lot better that year, even if Darren Williams gets traded. And then the more important thing is that Tyson Chandler was an expiring contract. He goes off the books that season, and then the Jazz have money to play with last season. And
what do you think the Jazz would have done with that money?
Well, I was looking at it. I don't know that there's necessarily a big free agent, and we don't tend to draw free agents, but
Right.
I think there's value. My personal opinion is that you don't always have to spend money. I think it's smart to just keep kind of low costs and then go and spend the money when you think you can actually compete for something more than, a 7th or an 8th seed. That's my personal opinion. I don't know if every Jazz fan would be okay with that, but that's kind of what I'd like to see the Jazz do is, save their pennies and put out as good of a team as you can, and then so that you can feel better about going for it when you have a chance to.
Well, feeling better about going for it's not really what it's all about. It's, the optics on this aren't as important as the actual talent level to me.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to your point, I think you're right on Tyson Chandler that actually would have added a whole new dimension to the Jazz. I also wonder if the Derek Favors trade, well, it probably would still happen because Chandler was an expiring contract. I haven't thought of that way before. I think based on their respective 2010 seasons, i.e. the season before before Al Jefferson was traded to the Jazz, Tyson Chandler had a pretty bad season before that with Charlotte. And, if you have a bad season with Charlotte, it starts to look like that's the end.
And he also, I think he was injured. He was not playing a lot of games.
That's true.
And he kind of surprisingly played 74 games 2 years ago. Although I believe that Charlotte team that he was a part of, he didn't look good, but they were, I believe, the top defense in the NBA. And maybe the year before, but he's been a part of some pretty fantastic defensive teams. So I'll just read off a couple other names in the transactions. I mean, this would have altered the franchise. We could have had the chance to pick up either Trent Playstead or Brian Zubek from BYU and Duke. And we all know that they would be probably starting for us in the finals last year if we had to pick them up.
Probably if they had played shooting guard or small forward, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but yeah, I mean, Greg Steemsma, not a big name, but Marcin Gortat was part of a trade that year we probably could have been in on, saving Orlando some money, which I think probably would have been a better fit long-term, a cheaper contract for a guy who has similar production overall.
But we didn't have a Jason Richardson or anything to trade Orlando, would we?
No, but I wonder if, taking his money and trading picks, that's the other thing. We gave up some decent picks in the Jefferson trade, but Tyson Chandler was acquired without Dallas giving up any picks. I mean, they gave up Matt Carroll, Eduardo Nahara, and no picks, some cash. So, that's another thing. But go ahead.
I actually looked up the picks. Did you look this up? Which picks ended up being transferred to the Timberwolves?
Well, I think that they used one on Donitas Montejunas, or however you spell that name.
Well, that's right. So they traded that pick to the Rockets then. For Brad Miller and Nikola Mirotic. And
Mirotic, or however you say it, he's supposed to be decent, but interesting. I'd forgotten about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I guess, Brad Miller's not someone that you spend nights losing sleep over for not having,
Sure.
And I don't think Mirotic is that good either. And yeah, I have no idea how to pronounce that, but I'm going with what I said.
Yeah, no problem.
And then the Timberwolves also traded their pick this year that they received in the trade to the Rockets too, so that's kind of an interesting side note. Picking up Chase Budinger in that trade, the Rockets ended up taking Terrence Jones, the small forward out of Kentucky.
Well, there you go. And we don't know if any of these players will be anything, but those are three names that at least have been mentioned as, top 10 prospects at some point. The other interesting thing, I don't think the Jazz would have done this, but if we had our trade exception open, and this would have been after we had traded for Devin Harris and Derek Favors, but, Baron Davis plus the first pick goes to Cleveland, and the Jazz could have taken that if they had known they were getting a first pick, and we all know that first pick miraculously turned into Kyrie Irving, so that would have probably been pretty far-fetched to happen.
Yeah, wait a second there, Clark. Who do we trade for? Who do we trade to the Clippers for that first pick?
Well, we take Baron Davis into our trade exception.
Okay, and
take their first pick. Maybe we trade him back Devin Harris or something.
No,
we'd
have to trade him Devin Harris because they gave up Mo Williams in that deal too. And all of a sudden, then we're without a point guard other than Baron Davis. I guess I don't know.
Well, I think we would have done what the Cavaliers did, which is basically, I think they played Baron Davis a few games, but mostly just said thanks for the number one pick, and Baron Davis can just have a seat down on the bench for a little bit. It would have been that's why I say that's not a thing the Jazz would probably do. But it's just,
it's a possibility. I see what you mean.
Anytime you make a trade or anytime you make a decision, you have to look at the ones that you could have made down the line, and that's basically what I was doing. The other option, and this would have been totally fine with me, is, roll with what we had. Maybe you re-sign either Korver or Matthews. You match one of those offers, and you try to run with Darren, Wes Matthews, Kirilenko, Millsap, and, Fasenko or another cheap, maybe a Kwame Brown. I would have loved to have seen a Millsap-Fasenko front court. I always wonder what would have happened if that had happened.
I suspect that we're a significantly worse team.
I think so too, but in the long run, save money. But so
I think it would have been fun. I love Fez, but I worry about how good that lineup is. So my point of view on this is that in the end we didn't we did not end up giving up a whole lot for Al Jefferson.
Mm-hmm.
So Brad Miller, Nikola Mirotic, and Chase Budinger is who Timberwolves ended up with in that trade. Of course, they also got Kosta Koufis, who I believe, did they trade him to Denver for a second rounder? It was not much.
Yeah, they traded Corey Brewer somehow.
Oh, that's
in that
right.
Deal.
Okay.
For, I can't even remember exactly who. Anthony Randolph? No, I forget.
Nah, Randolph is too good. And he's not very good, but he's probably better than to be named in that deal.
Yeah.
And so in the end, maybe I think the biggest asset that you give up there is the Boozer exception.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you do what you did, that exercise where you figure out, okay, what else could you do with that exception, and what players could you bring into that space? And Baron Davis isn't one I thought of. The Tyson Chandler move I think is